For 40 years, this Soviet tank has been the symbol of the liberation of Prague, freed by the Red Army in May 1945. Today, it is only exhibit number 1 in the Historical Museum of the Czech Republic. The pink color of its armored hull puzzles the tourists. After the Velvet Revolution in the Czech Republic, the battle tank was painted pink, dismounted from its pedestal and sent to the museum. But people remember the tank and carry flowers to the place where it once stood. May 2nd, 1945, the Reichstag already has the red flag flying, and the Berlin garrison has already surrendered. 1,411 days of war have passed. For most of us, these shots are the symbol of victory. Yet there was still another week of combat to be fought, and the last battle between the Red Army and the Fascist Reich. Up to now, one could have an interview with this person only with permission of the Federal Security Service of Russia. His life had become a subject of legends, but there are few who know the real facts from his biography. Pyotr Savelyev is the former commander of the Uragan Hurricane Reconnaissance Group sent to Prague in the spring of 1945.
My radio operators came running and said that Berlin had surrendered. Well then, many groups went out of the forests through the villages, heading to Berlin. But suddenly they faced heavy fire from the fascists. We had to come back.
Starting in 1944, the Soviet Committee for State Security sent about 40 reconnaissance detachments to the Czech Republic. Most of them had been annihilated right after landing or chased down by SS troops. In the spring of 1945, there were only 3 group commanders who were making radio contact with their central authority. About 40 intelligence men were hiding in the forests around Prague and kept track of all events in the Czech capital, night and day. Every week, Stalin received a report on the situation in Prague.
My men almost dropped with fatigue. The same can be said about the communication agents from the local people and my paratroopers. No one had time to sleep. If they could, they would get themselves strapped to a tree with their belt and take a little snooze for an hour, so to say. That is how it was. Everyone was very tense, as things that needed to be done were scheduled for every minute of our time.
Soviet intelligence managed to obtain the documents signed by Hitler on April 10th. The 36-page document began with the words, "Prague will be defeated under all circumstances, both from the enemies from within and from without." This order determined which city and industrial objects had to be mined and destroyed. Savelyev reports to Moscow, "Prague is within an inch of catastrophe."
For every Czech, the fate of Prague was always a matter of special concern. If you look at the building behind my back, Gradčany, the Kremlin of Prague, you will see the symbol of our motherland. It is natural we were afraid it might be destroyed. If you have ever been in Starometsky Square, you could see a little park in the place of which there once stood an old town hall burnt by the Germans. The same could happen to every building in Prague.
In May 1945, the German Center Army Group numbering 1 million soldiers was stationed to the east of Prague. The commander of this group was the last field marshal of the Third Reich, Ferdinand Schroner. 3 days before he committed suicide, Hitler had appointed him to command the whole Wehrmacht. The field marshal believed in fighting Bolsheviks to the last man standing, and this was the same center group, the objective of the Führer's pride and the basis of the fascist empire. 5 years ago, it had marched through Europe, annihilating peoples and cultures. Later, the Center Army Group fought to capture Moscow and Stalingrad, and took part in the Battle of Kursk. In those days, they thought they were invincible. But this time, they were a bit different soldiers and officers. Battered and less self-confident, yet still the most battle-ready troops of the Wehrmacht. The defense of Prague had been prepared in accordance with all rules of the German science of warfare. The city had supplies of ammunition sufficient to withstand 3 weeks of constant fighting. Prague was turned into a fortress. In case of a Soviet attack, the city had to become another Berlin for us.
Войска наши
Our troops were advancing successfully.
двигались. Паника в
Everyone was overcome with panic in the enemy's backland, including Czechoslovakia, supporters of fascism,
среди сторонников фашистов и среди
the soldiers, and the Czech police.
и полиции чешской.
In this building, now housing the law school of Charles University, the headquarters of SS troops were located in May 1945. Panic and fear made German generals act with maximum strictness. They declared a state of emergency in Prague. Detention facilities were filled with prisoners up to the bursting point. The Gestapo and SS punitive detachment, specially created to maintain German order in the occupied territories, detected and arrested members of the Czech underground. The network of German spies and informers operated like a fine-tuned clock.
И носа высунуть
They had a really tight control of the situation during the period of the German occupation.
период оккупации Чехословакии.
3 or 4 underground central committees were annihilated.
Или 4 подпольных.
There must have been some traitors.
Это же кто-то
And
предал
these were people of the same nation, betraying their own comrades.
своих же людей.
Both Germans and Czechs felt that the war was coming to an end, and Czechs were eager to see the day when they would finally be free. Though Prague was flooded by rumors of the fall of Berlin and the coming capitulation of Germany, thousands of Prague people still heard fascist boots and saw Hitlerite helmets in their streets. Any attempts to get information from beyond the limits of the occupied zone had been violently suppressed by Germans.
Everyone understood the war was coming to an end. One could feel it in the air. It would only take some signal to start it. Of course, in the Czech Republic, there were numerous partisan bands, and the activities of its underground became more widespread. But Germans were still strong, and only a spark was necessary to show that freedom was coming soon. All of us expected such a signal from Prague.
The village of Uezd nad Lesy in the eastern outskirts of Prague was so distant that the sound of fighting was not heard. There lived a family of an immigrant, a former White Guard captain, Valentin Yakovlev. Georgy Valentinovich, who was only 9 years old in 1945, went to a Czech primary school at that time. He remembers that during the war years, he could speak Russian only at home, to his parents. In Uezd nad Lesy and the neighboring villages, everyone lived with the hope that they would soon be freed from the German rule. However, the Soviet troops advancing towards the Czech Republic were slowed down by fighting the Schön Group, and managed to free the first Czech towns in the northeast of the country only in early May. They had another 300 kilometers to go to reach Prague.
At home, neither my father nor my mother knew that the Soviet troops were coming closer and that the end of the war was near. Nobody told me that. I could only see that in the evening, my father would go to the bedroom. There he had a folding screen, behind which he hung a map. He drew some lines and arrows on that map, in red and blue pencils.
This is an example of a frontline cinema digest. Here is how Soviet propaganda workers imagined the situation in Prague.
Только что моя пеленгация установила. Радиостанция работает в 5-м квартале. Немедленно выслать наряд. Идут.
Despite the almost comic effect of watching this nowadays, the documentary basis of such videos was real. During the years of war, the Germans managed to locate and destroy several underground radio stations. About a dozen underground groups operated in Prague at that time, developing plans to free the city.
Причинам вечернюю передачу. Слушай, славяне! Кровь за кровь, смерть за смерть.
In May 1945, there was still no single underground center, but many Prague people were ready to go out into the streets.
Когда мы узнали о том,
When we knew that preparations for the uprising were underway, it was very unexpected, because no group or party had the task of preparing an uprising.
готовить восстание. Но все отряды
Yet all parties sent secret messages to their center that preparations were underway.
реагировали, что готовится.
It took Pyotr Savelyev several days to gather the information and establish a connection with the underground members. The largest underground center was the Czech National Council, headed by the president of Prague University. He coordinated all underground activities in the city.
Тогда я был вынужден
Then I had to send a reliable secret message,
последним
being actually the last one to send the information, about who was preparing the uprising,
какие
who
силы
was supervising this work, and what forces they had at their command.
и готовят восстание.
The Prague Kremlin in 2005, relief of the Guard of Honor. These well-groomed fellows can pound their feet at parades and perform long practiced moves, but they never took part in any military operations. In May 1945, there was neither military experience nor real power able to overthrow the fascist occupation of the Czech Republic. The underground people were only a political organization, yet the hatred of Czechs for the enemy was so strong that an uprising could start at any time. The Czech Republic was one of the first countries in Europe to fall before the advance of fascist Germany. Moreover, France and Great Britain actually permitted Hitler to occupy the country. In the spring of 1939, German cameramen already filmed their Führer leaving the gates of the Prague Kremlin. In this 1942 video, we can see the Czech village of Lidice, one of the symbols of Nazi violence. After the assassination attempt against the chief of German police, Reinhard Heydrich, committed in the outskirts of Prague, Hitler ordered the shooting of every adult in Lidice and to level the village to the ground.
Back then, I lived in the town of Pardubice and remember how the Germans executed people in one of the neighboring villages. They destroyed that village in the same way as they did Lidice. They destroyed that village in the same way as they did Lidice. In that village, there lived relatives of the people who took part in the attempt to kill Heydrich, and they were all shot. For example, the owner of the town hotel. His son was my classmate, and I've remembered it all my life.
In May 1945, the Allies were already dividing Berlin, but in the Czech Republic, the fascists still held their positions. Czechs could not patiently wait for the Allies to come to free Prague, but their forces were too weak. In this situation, Soviet guerrilla parties could well become a core of the armed resistance. That is why Savelyev soon received an unexpected recommendation to take over the management of the rebel armed forces.
Запрещено было нам
We were strictly forbidden to interfere in any internal issues of the country, especially in political matters.
политически способствовать чехословацкому народу,
We had to support the Czech people in their struggle against fascism,
оказывать помощь, но
provide them with help but take no commanding position under any circumstances.
After the refusal of Soviet intelligence men to take part in the prepared uprising, the Czech National Council began negotiations with the Vlasov's army, then positioned only 30 kilometers from Prague. Lieutenant General of the Red Army, the hero of the Battle of Moscow, Andrei Vlasov, was captured in the summer of 1942. He agreed to cooperate with Germany and began forming the Russian Liberation Army, RLA. Soldiers and officers were recruited from the huge numbers of Soviet prisoners. Fascists read to the prisoners the notorious Order of Stalin, according to which all soldiers captured by the Germans were dubbed traitors of the motherland, and offered them to enter the Russian Liberation Army led by General Vlasov. In May 1945, Vlasov understood perfectly well that Germany had lost the war.
The Russian Liberation Army.
The Czech writer Stanislav Oski is known as the author of several books on the Stanislav movement. He made his first historical notes 60 years ago, when he entered the RLA by chance and served as the battalion's interpreter. Professor Oski remembers that in May 1945, the 12,000 well-equipped soldiers and officers of the RLA did not want to obey Hitler's orders, and had even less desire to fight against the Soviet troops. It is here, in the castle of Sukhomesty, near Prague, that the temporary headquarters of the Vlasov army was situated. All the territory around the castle was full of tanks, trucks, horses, and wagon trains. One after the other, members of the Czech committee came from Prague asking for support of the uprising. But Vlasov was ill at that time, and all negotiations were held by General Bunachenko. His interpreter was Stanislav Oski.
Everything was made in a hurry. Then it seemed things were done to the benefit of both parties. For volunteers of the RLA, it would be an exoneration for once fighting under German colors, and Prague would avoid needless casualties. One of the chiefs of the Prague Rebellion Committee, Colonel Riddle, obtained agreement from General Bunachenko that his division would march on foot to Prague and take part in the uprising on the side of the rebels.
Vlasov's commanders knew too well what they and their soldiers should expect once they returned to their motherland. That is why participation in the rebellion on the side of Czechs in exchange for political asylum after the war seemed to them the most reliable way of saving their lives. While Bunachenko and other officers negotiated with the Czechs, hundreds of RLA rank-and-file soldiers tried to contact representatives of the Soviet authorities. Some of them managed to contact Savilyev's group.
I was able to persuade about 100 of Vlasov's soldiers, who actually joined this army only in 1944, early 1945, after being freed from concentration camps, and who had no choice. They either had to enter Vlasov's army or die in the camp. They set a condition to be pardoned after the thing was over. I had no such authority and refused them, stating my opinion straightforwardly. Your future will depend on how you behave when the rebellion starts.
Today, this building on Vinogradska Street houses the Czech radio, just like it did 60 years ago. It became one of the symbols of the Prague Rebellion. Veterans came here every year. Among them, there are people who were here on May 5, 1945. It was then when Prague people began tearing fascist flags and signs off their houses and began fighting SS troops. Radio journalists stopped broadcasting service to send an emergency message.
On May 5th, it was a Saturday. We came to Aunt Fandy, sat at the table, began talking about life, and then heard an unusual message from the radio. Exactly at 12:30.
Пражское радио зовет всех патриотов на помощь. Všichni do Českého rozhlasu jsou šílení ze čeští lidé. Přijďte co nejdříve. Voláme české vojsko, české světníky, přijďte i hned do Českého rozhlasu, přijďte nám pomoct.
Freedom had broken away from the captivity. People went to the streets.
SSáci zde vraždí české lidi. Pozor, pod Baltínovy ulice je volný.
Anyone having any weapons began joining in small parties with other people. Fascists and their collaborators were arrested and escorted through the streets in the view of the city's residents. They hurried to the center of the capital, to the radio building. Reporters called on their compatriots again and again. There was no stopping the uprising now.
It was just 20 then. My friends and I organized their own little underground group and were preparing for the uprising. Yet when it all began on May 5th, it was out of the blue for us. I could not wait to take part in these events. I had been to Stare Mesto Square, near the radio building, in Vinogradska, and in the evening my friends and I joined the rebels in Leningrad. One should take into account that the people had no military background, especially the youth, who had never served in the army and could not handle any weapon at all. Now these young fellows fought an army possessing battlefield experience of many years. It took a lot of inspiration. The young rushed into the fight without thinking, and the casualties were huge.
Right after the events at the radio building, the Czech National Council abandoned its underground status and came out to lead the uprising. The rebels managed to drive away the German garrison of Prague rather quickly and free a part of the city. Field Marshal Schroner had to take some troops from the front line, where he was fighting against the Soviet army, to Prague. Prague people began building barricades to protect their city. 1,500 barricades of overturned cars and pavestone emerged in just one day.
For Germans, Prague was first of all an important transportation junction. And when the uprising began, many military units were blocked. Schroner could not afford any resistance areas in his back, as he would be cut away from his supplies and ammunition dumps. The uprising destroyed all German plans for the defense of Prague.
German armies headed towards the city. The uprising was now in danger. Senior Lieutenant Saviliev understood that Prague would be finished without the help of the Red Army. It was then when Saviliev broke the initial order to stay away from Czech politics. He wrote an appeal to the Soviet and American armies on behalf of the Czech people.
A packet of paper brought for rolling cigarettes did very well as the material for writing the appeal. The appeal to the Allies was created by Soviet paratrooper intelligence men. Literally, it said as follows. The text was concealed, probably only because this intelligence group belonged to a state security agency.
Очевидно только потому, что это действовала разведка органов госбезопасности.
Прага! Прага говорит! Красная армия! Слушайте нашу передачу!
In just a few hours, Saviliev heard his appeal on the radio. Now the whole world knew that Prague had rebelled. One of the first people to receive this message was a tank commander from Chelyabinsk Volunteer Armored Brigade, Valentin Chernov.
This is Prague, the Czech Prague, because Warsaw also has a Prague speaking. The Czech Prague speaking. German fascists are killing civilians. We built barricades. We are resisting, but we have no weapons, nothing. Send us tanks and airplanes. We will fight to the end.
Within a few minutes, the message arrived at the desk of the Soviet Marshal Konev, whose divisions were finishing off the remains of fascist troops in Germany. Over the telephone, Stalin gave an order to take away some troops from the German direction and send them to help Prague immediately. The last operation of the Soviet army in Europe began.
It had been raining for 3 days. Despite the rain, we were going to the Czechoslovakian border, to the mountains. The colonel asked peasants, how could we get to a settlement in the mountains? The peasants said one could only go there on a cart, and only when it is not raining. Tank driver Vasily Khrushchev said, "We will get through, Comrade Colonel. I promise you we will." And our tanks went there.
By 1945, the Red Army had become the most numerous and powerful army in the world, and its generals, the most experienced combat leaders. It is the Soviet Marshal Ivan Stepanovich Konev that Prague sees as its liberator. But yet this large marble monument to the combat leader is accepted by most Czechs as a symbol of the mighty Red Army, which came from the Volga to the Vltava and saved the Czech capital from the fascists.
The first village we entered was Gastomel, not far from Sinus. About 100 people went out into the street. In front of the crowd ran an elderly woman. We were young then. We regarded everyone over 30 as old people. She raised her hands. "Dear sons, if only you knew how we have waited for you. The Red Army. Ruda Armada, Ruda Armada." And then she began embracing us. She said, "Oh my God, now I can die peacefully." Our Komsomol member, Tolya Kastunov, the tank driver, came up to her, embraced her, and said, "Why should you die, mother? Now it is the time for living. Freedom has come. Czechoslovakia will be free."
On May 7th, Soviet tanks were fighting through the Czech land towards its capital. They had more than 1 day to go to reach Prague. Meanwhile, German troops were already crushing the barricades and stamping out the rebellion. At this moment, the Vlasov division of General Bunachenko came to the rescue of the rebels. They managed to set several enemy tanks on fire and stop the advance of the Germans. The Czech radio called them liberators and asked the people to trust and to help them.
Vlasov's troops came to this part of Prague, to the embankment, and occupied positions before a railway bridge. There was a message that German tanks were approaching from the south, and our group leader wanted to stop them here. The commander of the Vlasov detachment suggested giving us 4 Faust anti-tank rockets and training 4 of our volunteers in handling them. Yet tanks never reached our positions. They were destroyed earlier at the water retaining station. So alas, our act of heroism was not to be.
Memorial plaques are still hanging on the walls of the houses where the Prague volunteers lived, who accomplished their feat in those days of May. Unarmed people lived to stop experienced and well-equipped Wehrmacht soldiers. Prague remembers them.
Here is the building where I lived. Our windows opened onto the yard, and Germans were shooting at our house from there. Until the recent times, there were marks of the bullets on the upper stories. They broke our window, and my mother covered me from chips with her body. We had to move to the basement. Germans grabbed people and took them away to execute them. They were going to set on fire the buildings where people were locked. Vlasov soldiers defended us, and there was a 2-hour fight near our building.
Schorner failed to crush the resistance quickly and never realized the defense plan for Prague, signed by Hitler himself, because of the interference of Vlasov's troops. The Center Army Group was surrounded. In their back, the rebellion raged on, while Soviet divisions were pressing on from the north and from the east. In this building on Bartolomiev Street, the events that changed the course of the rebellion took place on May 7th. Vlasov's general, Bunachenko, arrived here to negotiate with the Czech National Council. But Czech communists who held the majority in the council knew too well the attitude of Stalin to Vlasov's troops and understood that the Soviet Union would not forgive their cooperation with traitors.
They told Bunachenko that nobody invited him to Prague. But as he was already here, The decision was up to him to make, to take part in the rebellion or not, at his own peril and risk. Therefore, the document signed that Suchomaski was proclaimed as void, as other people had come to lead the uprising.
До čela toho povstání přišla úplně jiná garnitura.
Vlasov's commanders set an ultimatum that the Czech National Council should guarantee their political asylum, or the Vlasov army would leave the line of defense. In an hour, the army received the order to retreat. Vlasov's soldiers tore off their insignia and left Prague in small groups or one by one. The city was left without any protection.
May the 8th became the most critical day for all of us. We had no weapons, no communication, no experience, and we did not even know where Americans, Germans, or Russians were. Over Prague, German bombers flew and did with the city whatever they wanted. They destroyed several buildings in the city center, including the famous town hall. Meanwhile, Americans positioned 80 kilometers from Prague did not stir a finger to help.
There were 12 hours left to the arrival of the Red Army. No one knows how things would have gone in Prague if it were not for the Soviet intelligence men. Saviliev's group and Czech partisans arranged a real diversionary war in the zone where Schroner's troops were positioned. They attacked transportation junctions and communication points of the Germans. The paratroopers understood they could not stop the advance of the enemy, but they tried hard to disarrange the German troops and slow them down for at least an hour or two.
I worried so much, asking myself why things were going on so slowly, because people were dying at the barricades, and the army of Field Marshal Schroner was rushing towards Prague. This would be the end of Prague, I thought.
Here's an extract from Field Marshal Schroner's interrogation protocols. Schroner referred to all who fought in his back in May 1945 as partisans. Partisans created unbearable conditions in the back of my troops. Railroads and most industrial objects were out of service. Supply services could not work in a normal way. At the end of the day, I lost communication with my troops and therefore the ability to command them. The many thousand-strong Schroner group turned into an incontrollable mass of people, while the last Field Marshal of the Reich abandoned his men, flew to the American zone of occupation, and surrendered. The last operation of the Wehrmacht went completely wrong. Prague did not become another Berlin for the Germans.
We realized what we had really done only after the war. We saw that we had done a great thing. We prevented Field Marshal Schroner's army from breaking into Prague.
A torrent of Soviet tanks moved in to help the rebel city. The troops managed to get through the roughest areas and went at their maximum speed. By the evening of May 8th, Soviet tank commanders could see Prague in their binoculars. A young Czech, Zdenek, was sitting on the tank of Valentin Chernov to accompany the Soviet column.
He saw Prague burning, and he cried bitterly. We stood behind the turret, and I told him, "Zdenek, don't." I remember myself crying when I saw Gomel burning, and I thought, let him cry. He will love his land all the more.
In the 2 years of war, the Chelyabinsk Volunteer Armored Brigade went from the Urals to Prague. It left behind dozens of liberated European cities. Komsomol leader Valia Chernov and his comrades in arms, Alexander Filipov, Ilya Shklovsky, Pavel Batarev, Leonid Brakov, Nikolai Kovrgin, and Ivan Goncharenko, knew it was the time to clear the last height in this war. On the time from May 8th to May 9th, the German government in Berlin signed the unconditional surrender. The document signed by the leaders of the Reich summed up the results of the 6 years of war. Meanwhile, the first Soviet tanks entered Prague.
It was about 3 a.m. It was quiet. We saw the street was crossed by a huge heap of something, a barricade. They thought these were German tanks coming. And then, I don't know how it happened, that they recognized us. A Czech climbed onto the barricade and shouted, "Ruda Armada! Long live Ruda Armada!"
The elation of this unexpected meeting with the first Red Army soldiers was so strong that Czechs could hardly let them go out of their embrace. The Soviet tank commanders who managed to get through the mountains within such short terms, went many kilometers and broke down the German resistance, were treated as real heroes. But there were still islands of German resistance in Prague, and the tanks had to proceed. Now, our camera follows the same route that the Soviet tanks took on the dawn of May 9th.
We turn to the right. To the right side of us there is a wall, and I can see a bridge in front of us. The tank went out, turned around, and covered 15 or 20 meters before being hit by a self-propelled gun from the Vltava. One shell hit right into the commander's cupola, and I was blown away from the tank. I hit my head against the pavestone and lost conscience. In
this fight, Ivan Goncharenko died, a friend of Valentin Chernov and commander of the T-34 tank number 25, which was the first to enter Prague. Olsenska Cemetery in Prague is the last resting place of hundreds of Soviet soldiers and officers. The first man buried there was the Guards lieutenant, Ivan Goncharenko. He was only 25 that day. On the morning of May 9th, the main forces entered Prague. From the north, the tank army of Generals Rybelko and Lilyushenko, and army groups of Moskalenko and Iremenko from the east. The Prague operation was over. More than 500,000 German soldiers and officers were surrounded. By the evening, the city was free. Czechs went into the streets. For them, it was not only the end of the war, but also the end of a 6-year occupation. Red Army soldiers became welcome guests in every Czech family. In the Yakovlev family, they entertained the father's fellow countryman, a simple soldier from the Voronezh region, who came to the center of Europe.
His name was Seva. I still remember him. He was an elderly man, and I remember his beautiful mustache very well. I looked at him. I looked at his garrison cap, at the star on it. I decided for myself that I had to have this star, because I had to have something to boast before my friends. I did not know that someday I would be as old as I am now, and that I would be celebrating my 60th birthday, and that this star would come back to the Czech land. This star is here with me. These are shoulder boards of a simple Red Army man, Seva. And here is the star which he took off from his cap and said, "Keep it." I am grateful to this Seva even today. Thank you.
In today's Prague, not only monuments and memorial plaques can remind us of the war, In the center of the city, there is the old town hall destroyed by the German bomb. A part of it was never restored on purpose. Czechs know how to respect their history and honor traditions. In Prague, there are many streets with Russian names. Here is Konev Street. Another street is named after Marshal Eremenko, who also liberated Prague in 1945. Here is a quiet street in Prague District 4, named after Ivan Goncharenko. It was named so just several years ago. In many ways, it happened thanks to the district prefect, Zdeněk Gavorka.
Since I became the prefect of this district, I wanted to know its history, and I think some events should not be forgotten even 60 years later. Moreover, I strongly dislike people trying to falsify history. I want us to keep the memory of those who gave their lives for Prague.
These are shots from Miejski Zvezdy, the Stars of May feature film. It is almost the only film showing us the tank that stood in one of Prague's squares for more than 40 years. It was believed that in this tank, Guards Lieutenant Ivan Goncharenko was the first to break into the city. Today, the city authorities made a fountain in the place of the monument. Every spring on May 9th, people bring flowers there. They like to appoint meetings and walk with children here. Meanwhile, the tank, painted pink, was sent to the museum after the Velvet Revolution. As a matter of fact, this tank never fought a battle and never had a shot at the enemy. Instead of the famous T-34 tank that liberated Prague, the IS-2 model, Josef Stalin, had been standing on the pedestal for 40 years. The real tank, number 25, that Goncharenko once commanded, was kept all this time in the same museum.
It is a paradox, but in the view of Soviet generals, the real tank with marks of shell penetrations, which are characteristic of a battle tank, was not fit for the Prague pedestal. That is why a brand new IS-2 was mounted there. I think that if there was a battle tank in the center of Prague, nobody would dare to paint it pink, because its armor still keeps the remains of blood of the soldiers who liberated Prague.
Back in 1945, Soviet tanks saved Prague. If they did not come in time, the Czech capital would have been destroyed, and the rebellion would have been stamped out. The number of civilian casualties would have been terrifying. Yet we also have something to be thankful for, to the participation of the Prague Uprising. If they did not start it, Germans could have settled into positions in Prague and resisted to the last man standing. Then, many of the people whom the camera showed today alive would not live to see this day.